Well, good morning, Paul and Jeff. Thank you for accepting the interview. Do you both mind taking a brief moment to introduce yourself and what your research interests are?
Sure. I'm Paul Mitchell. I'm a professor here in the Department of Agricultural and Applied Economics, an extension specialist as well. And I work a lot on for this project, I very much focus on the economics of input management for crop production. It's broadly what I work on, nitrogen fertilizer, but also things like pesticides, pest management in general, um, pathogens, crop diseases, things like that.
Yeah, and I'm Jeff Hadechek, and I'm an assistant professor in agricultural and applied economics and also an extension specialist. My research, and specifically as it relates to this project as well, addresses sort of the economics of conservation adoption on farms, as well as sort of the landscape level impacts on water quality, soil health, and so on.
Absolutely. Can you both talk about why is the research that you're doing significant?
Yeah, I've been working a lot on nitrogen management for potato. In the central sands, potato is the major crop in some sense. Corn is important as well as all the processing vegetables and such. But potato is a large nitrogen user. And what I've been working on is trying to come up with better ways to manage the crop's nitrogen from an economic perspective. It's always, these functions get very flat out there in the sense of an extra 10, 20, 30, 40 pounds, the response in the crop can be very hard to detect. And so it's very easy in these situations to add a little more. And so I've been trying to adapt a process called the maximum return to nitrogen approach that's used for corn recommendations to try to adapt that to the potato world. And that the difference between potato and corn is potato, the size of the tubers matters. It's not just how many pounds, how many hundredweight of potato you get per acre. It's also what size they are. And so we're trying to model the economics of both the size and the total production, how many hundredweight per acre you get. And that's never been done before. So we got to work out some stuff. And there's a lot of math and estimation and work to do yet. But my goal would be to have that done and ready to go here in the next year or two.
That sounds great.
Yeah, for me, I think bigger picture, we as Wisconsinites are all affected by like what happens on farm. Not only do we eat the food that comes from the agricultural production that happens in the state, the cheese, the potatoes, the corn that's fed to cattle, but we also are affected by the environmental and natural resource consequences of what happens on farm. And particularly, some of us know all too well of harmful algal blooms that happen in the state, or high nitrate levels in our state's groundwater, right? So, what's the right balance between ensuring that those food products can be supplied sort of cheaply and cost effectively, but also ensuring that we're not doing undue damage to our state's natural resources? And furthermore, like, how do we sort of reverse sort of those trends, and how do we ensure that our farms are not are mitigating some of those environmental and natural resource impacts? But at the same time, like, right, farmers have to make profit, and so ensuring that those effects, those mitigation strategies, cover crops, no-till, keeping those nutrients in our soils and keeping our soils in our field. How do we ensure that those things are economically effective for our farmers as well? So, yeah, I think balancing those two things is a very big picture goal, but I think that's what gets me excited about the work that I do. So.
That also gets me very excited about the work that both of you are doing. Um, my next question is, who are the potential users of your current research?
My work's going to be focused primarily for farmers or people making recommendations for potato growers. But I think it's broader. Eventually, I think we're updating. I think in general the overall nitrogen management recommendations, and as well as phosphorus and some of these other ones, the nutrients here in the state. But those are the two big ones that have a lot of water quality impacts, surface and groundwater. And so, people who are making those decisions or advising people who are making those decisions would be my target audience. And it it's very much like what Jeff was saying. It's part of that process, but you have to work with those people. But there's also a bigger process as well of balancing these impacts. And so you need the micro level foundations for what the farmers, the people making these decisions, or advising the people making decisions, but it has to reflect the broader issues that are we're trying to deal with here in the state, in our groundwater, in the central sands.
Yeah, and a project that I'm specifically working on in relation to the Rural Partnership Institute funding is evaluating the state's producer-led watershed um, program. And these institutions, this program facilitated by the Department of Agricultural Trade and Consumer Protection, are really trying to incentivize some of these conservation practices across the state, and also getting this sort of social element around having conversations around water quality, and having demonstrations around how do we improve water quality. And so, I think economists are inherently social scientists. I've said this a few times in my work. And so we study human behavior. And farmers are humans, and they have social elements as to how to adopt conservation practices. And I think, you know, maybe 10 years ago, 20 years ago, talking about the water quality impacts of agriculture was taboo in the state, right? And I think what this program has done, the producer-led watershed program has made this sort of normal for our farmers to have conversations about this, and be really honest about what practices can we implement. Um, and so the audience, I get back to your original question. I think the audience for this work and this project specifically is across the board. So I think it's for farmers to evaluate what they're doing, and is the money that they're inputting into these producer-led programs paying off. But also from a state perspective, like the state facilitates this program and puts like $1 million annually into this program, and are we getting returns to that program? And so from a stakeholder perspective, I think there are certainly the audience is certainly farmers, and farmers that are participating in these producer-led groups specifically, but also from a policy perspective, are we giving our farmers equipping our farmers with the resources and financial support that they need to scale this up across the state? Um, so, yeah.
Thank you. It does. I do agree that it does take a village for the community to solve the environmental problem that we are all experiencing in the Central Sands, but also keep agriculture profitable, right? My last question is, what have been some challenges and what have been some solutions that has occurred in your research that is related to this work?
The way I think of it for these nitrogen management recommendations, let's say everything's successful and come up with some numbers and a process, it's all very technical. And it's back to what Jeff's point was about the farmers are all part of a social system. It's more than just the money for most people. And that's understanding that broader social context. It's a Rural Partnerships Institute. It's about developing social systems to support some of these decisions. Life is about more than money, and so that's the challenge, is to get beyond the focus on profitability and net returns on this tool. Will be focused on that, but placing that in that broader context of the farmer, the family making decisions about things. And I always think farmers are at ground zero for a lot of these impacts. They live in their communities, they drink the water, they see their friends and neighbors drinking this water as well, and that matters to them. And so it's more than just the dollars and cents and this little technical tool. And that's the challenge. In my feeling, is that's harder work. That's what this partnerships is about, is building some of these social structures around these tools, this science, this data.
Yeah, and I think for me, specifically related to the project that I was just talking about, we as economists are really focused on identifying cause and effect, and ensuring that if we see changes or trends that are changing over time, what was the cause of that, right? And for our producer-led watershed groups, maybe we have seen sort of increases in conservation adoption qualitatively, like the Department of Agriculture has sort of documented this via surveys. But the unanswered question, and what I think is important here, is what's the counterfactual? Like, what would have been in absence of these producer-led groups? And so what's difficult to identify, and it's a statistical and it's a data challenge, it's a heavy data lift, is ensuring and identifying what that counterfactual would have been. And so we're assembling data sets on ambient water quality in the state through our state's stream flows. Then we're going to merge that onto the details and information that we have about these producer-led groups. But also we're going to use sort of like comprehensive, like rarely used data sets, remotely sensed data sets from satellites on conservation adoption. And in total, what this is getting at is getting an idea and a sense of what those trends were prior to this program being instituted, right? So we can then identify whether this was just like, if we see increased conservation adoption in a given area, in a given producer-led group, maybe it's in the Central Sands, was that just a continuation of the trend that would have happened initially, or is it actually a break in the trend? Did these groups institute a break in the trend? And really, I mean, answering that question requires sort of these comprehensive data sets. We have to know land cover across the entire state in order to be able to get statistics about that. We have to know like what water quality is at a given point in time. And so, yeah, I mean, I guess the main challenge is data, but by assembling sort of all of these resources that we have from a variety of different projects, we kind of come together and be able to merge these sort of spatially and use some of these new techniques, particularly in like remotely sensed technology to identify cover crop adoption and tillage adoption in our state's lands. So, yeah.
That sounds great. I'm going to add one last question, which is if you can use 3 to 4 sentences as a recommendation for our farmer audience, for our farmer helper like myself as a conservation professional, what would you recommend them to improve on, or to do more, or to do less of, in terms of their involvement in the agricultural business to reduce environmental impacts?
I'll go ahead and
Yeah,
start.
thanks.
I think, I mean, one of the things that is really interesting about these producer groups and some of the other things that are happening in the state around water quality right now are that they're putting the onus on the farmer to be the experimenter. So, experiment with cover crops for a year and see what it's like on your farm. Experience with reduced nitrogen rates on your farm and see what it does to your yields. That puts the responsibility, in the farmer's court, but also then gives them information and to be able to demonstrate to their neighbors about like what are the impacts of these practices, both economically, agronomically. But rather, it changes sort of us as extension professionals going and like just saying these things, but it actually creates sort of real on the ground, data and visuals to see like what these changes are. So I guess just continue experimenting and become scientists in yourself in terms of doing your own experiments on farm.
Yeah, I think of that as citizen science in the ag world and in ag water quality. The thing I would add is don't be afraid to talk about what you're doing on your farm and stuff like that, to be a self-promoter. But I always think in a Midwestern way, which is kind of quietly go about doing a good job and stuff, and not being in everyone's face about it. We have those. I think we have enough of that in the social media world and online and everything. But in a Wisconsin way, where we're proud of what we do and we're doing a good job, and be willing to talk about that with your friends, your neighbors, your community in various ways, in a way that resonates with them. I think farmers are well positioned to do that in their communities, and some will move up to the higher levels, regional or statewide, or even beyond at the national level. It help identify yourself. If you can do that and you think you're good at it, you can even do training and get better at it. That's important as well. Don't forget your voice.
Cool. Thank you both for your time today, and thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next episode.